This is Take Back Your Country, and I'm David Flint. I wanted to talk to you today about the massive influx of neo-Marxist ideas into Australia, which initially seemed ridiculous at the beginning, but eventually become adopted in the media by government and opposition, and suddenly we find that they are now Australian policy. And there's a whole string of them. The latest is critical race theory, which argues that the white race is essentially discriminatory, always takes advantage of its position, and discriminates against other races, whatever it does. And we've had other things like gender fluidity. We've had, and we certainly still have, global warming, which is also essentially a neo-Marxist idea or taken over by them for their own benefit. And earlier we've had other dogmas. For example, we had same-sex marriage where any discriminatory problems there could have been cured by civil unions without incorporating same-sex marriage into the Marriage Act, probably unconstitutionally. And that's the situation we keep on having in this country while government avoids doing the important things that it should be doing for the people of Australia and the advancement of this country. As I say, it all seems to now come from the United States. I would say for three reasons. First, the decline of religion. And for that, I look to a saying attributed to Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Difficult to find it in anywhere in his writings. But Gilbert Keith Chesterton certainly taught this. It expresses his thinking, and that is, when man stops believing in God, it's not that he believes in nothing. He will believe in anything. It's not that he believes in nothing, he will believe in anything. And the reason probably is that we are programmed to believe, take away the Creator, take away religion, and people start believing in something else. Global warming, for example, it has become a religion for some people. And there are other things which seem to become religions, and people adopt them without any rational thinking as to whether they are true or not, and why they're being pushed into believing that. So that's the first thing, the decline of religion. The second thing is Lenin's useful idiots. Lenin is attributed with the observation that there are capitalists who are such useful idiots that they will even sell the communists the rope with which they will hang them. And there's certainly a greater number of billionaires, of very rich people, people in industry and on boards and so on, who are completely dazzled by something that Lenin never had, and that is the market, the wealth that China will bring. And so they moved their industry to China. They didn't care that they were sacking a lot of American workers. They didn't care if the communists insisted that they hand over their intellectual property and thus develop a communist country. The vast amount of intellectual property that China has managed to get its hands on have allowed a backward country, ruined by Mao Zedong, to advance economically, and certainly from the point of view of intellectual property, so that it can now be in a position where it may rival the United States. So that's the second matter. These people who were prepared to give up the advancement that the United States had, prepared to develop and advance a communist country purely for their own personal wealth. And we see it in all sorts of institutions, not just industry. We see it in Hollywood, where the size of the Chinese market beckons, and also in sports, as with basketball, which is very popular in China, but dare the American basketball organization not toe the line, and they will have that market closed off from them. And the third point is the essential evolution of Marxism. Marx taught that communism was inevitable, that the proletariat would rise and they would see that they were being exploited, and they would end free enterprise, and there would be this glorious paradise, a workers' paradise. And it was inevitable. Lenin realized that it wasn't inevitable, that you had to do something because the working class is essentially conservative, as it is here in Australia. That's why the Labor Party is abandoning it for the inner city elites, who are so much more revolutionary in their thinking than the working class, who are essentially conservative. And it creates a problem for the Labor Party. But that is what's happened. There has been this change in communism, a realization from Lenin that communism was not inevitable. You had to look to somebody else to bring it in. Lenin had the great advantage of the First World War and the complete disruption, the collapse of the Tsarist regime in Russia. But we've had different developments. Gramsci, for example, arguing that communism must be developed culturally. You had to take over institutions, particularly the cultural institutions, the media. You had to get into them and run them from the inside. You had to do the same with education, the schools and the universities. And then you had the great advantage of thereby issuing propaganda to the children and the young people. And they did that. They marched through the institutions. There was a man in America, Herbert Marcuse, a philosopher who developed that theory further and looked to newer areas of potential persons to push the Marxist ideal. For example, in the area of race, so that we now have Black Lives Matter, which is essentially a Marxist organization, Antifa, which is the same, and other organizations, for example, in relation to intersex, gender fluidity, gender being the word which suggests that the differences between men and women are merely a matter of choice, and a man can become a woman can become a man, and there are sexes, or genders rather, in between. A very strange idea, but something which obviously undermines a lot of institutions, including the family. So we have those three factors. We have the decline of religion. We have, secondly, people willing to sell out, useful idiots, as Lenin called them. They're willing to sell out, not so much to Russia now, but to China. Let China become the dominant power if we become wealthy. And finally, we have that change in the basis of the people pushing Marxism or willing to go into Marxism, and they've expanded this into race, into sex, and so on. That is the situation, and we find this in every Western country, and we find it in Australia, so much so that the political class now essentially function for the advantage of these ideas rather than doing their job, rather than acting on behalf and for the benefit of the population of Australia and the advancement of this country. There is not, as I so often say, there is not a significant problem in Australia which, if it were not created by the politicians, has not been made significantly worse by them. And they've given up, for example, harvesting water. This country cannot develop further without vast amounts of water, which now can be provided much more easily than in the past with modern technology. They've taken away one of our great comparative advantages, that is cheap power, cheap electricity from our excellent coal and our potential to produce nuclear power. And they've given us, the politicians have given us, among the dearest electricity in the world, which will soon become unreliable because they're closing down the coal-fired power stations in Australia. And they've managed immigration in such a way as to cram people into 3 capital cities instead of, with development, spreading them across Australia. All very badly handled. And perhaps one of the worst things they've done is in education. They've run down, by allowing the teaching of Marxism in the schools, they've run down the teaching of the basic things which are necessary, so that standards in education are now significantly lower than they were a couple of decades ago, and lower than in comparative countries. And that is to the great loss of Australia. The important thing then, fellow Australians, is we must make the politicians accountable. We must take back our country.